Speaker is Aaron Mills, and Aaron's putting the mic on. He's most of you know him. Aaron is a researcher here at AFC Harrington, so he's going to talk a little bit about wheat and the Yield Enhancement Network.
Thanks, Peter. Okay, I had to use a real mic. I just feel like somebody's sneaking up behind me. I have that thing on. Okay, so the Yield Enhancement Network, a lot of people who participated in this are in the room today, and I'm just going to do some of kind of a 30,000 foot overview of what we did and some of the conclusions that we came through from the data. So this was a partnership between Agriculture Canada, a company called ADAS in the UK, and the Atlantic Grains Council. So I'll be talking about Roger, which is this fella here, and Ruth, and they both work with ADAS quite a bit, so then you'll know who I'm talking about. And these two other large mammals are just people who like to get their picture taken, I guess. This is taken from Roger's slide, and this is kind of the premise of the yen. And the way he likes to describe it is you know, like the dashboard in your car, and we talk about things in terms of the amount of solar energy that we have, and you know, the thermal time, which is your heat units, and the amount of water that comes down, but also the amount of water that can be taken up by the plant. And that basically drives the growth. And so ADAS works really closely with their levy board, which is AHDB, which is essentially the UK's equivalent of the Atlantic Grains Council, but for the entire country. And they developed this wheat growth guide. Anybody can go online and download it. Everything's about winter wheat in it, though, so just keep that in mind. And there's this graph in this book, and this is essentially the premise that I was just talking about. So we have this rooting depth. You see this goes down to 2 meters. This actually came up when we had a meeting here in the wintertime, or our awards ceremony actually. Keep this in mind. So this is what they calculate their model to, is a rooting depth of 2 meters, okay? Here's your thermal time, so this is your accumulated heat units, and then this is the amount of biomass in tons per hectare that accumulates through time. And we've got our soil texture and soil depth, root growth, intercepting all the rain, taking up the nutrients, and solar energy. So essentially this is their fall. The big difference between the UK and here is winter. So they don't really have winter over there. Things just kind of grow through the whole season. The ground doesn't freeze. So you do get that initial burst of growth, and then it carries on through the rest of the season. So it's all about the amount of light that you can intercept through the growing season. And for them, a highly achievable yield is 4.4 tons to the acre. Okay, so just to put it in perspective, their yield competition, the top grower got over 7 tons to the acre. Okay, there's a reason for these differences, and the whole point of this competition is to try to find out what's different in PEI compared to the UK. So basically they take all this data and they feed it into this growth model, and we calibrate the growth model to figure out what the potential yield is, given, you know, essentially doing like our best with the cards that were dealt, right? And so on the lighter soils, this is the range here. So basically, you know, 24 tons per hectare is the purple, and they can easily achieve that, or potentially achieve that in the southeast of England. But then up north, it's a little bit different story, but it's still around 10 tons per hectare. Or sorry, would that be around 7 tons per acre? Okay, so this was the timeline last year. Hire a good summer student. We had a kickoff meeting, basically go through the summer data collection, sample processing, data analysis, and then we had an awards presentation here just after Christmas. We're going to carry this on this year and next year, and we're going to follow the same timeline. This year was all about figuring out what works, what doesn't work, and we were working out the bugs. So basically, to sign up a field, you would go onto the Atlantic Grains Council website, and there's a little link that you can click on. And Alan tells me that link is going to be active there tonight. So if anybody's interested in putting their field in this, like right now, then you can probably do that by tonight. You know, it was kind of hit or miss whether growers actually did this, but our summer student, we went to every field and then entered it in if it wasn't entered in already. And this calculates the size of the field, and then we use that calculation for the yield. This is a breakdown of everybody's role. The Grains Council did a lot for farmer recruitment. They did the web development for farmers to enter their fields. And Harvey and Brian went through and did all the soil sampling for both the soil health analysis and the S3 analysis through the provincial lab. And finally, the AGC, they picked up the bill for the award ceremony at a pub downtown. Okay, so the farmer provided all their seed data, management data, and basically had to put up with us bothering them once in a while to get information and walk through the fields and stuff like that. And then we had a student on this full time. So basically, all this guy did, he worked his ass off for the summer. You know, there was actually growers who were concerned that to make sure that, you know, we were paying this guy enough, because he really was working his butt off. He was in a truck every week. He was calculating the growth stages from every field. Took physical samples, all the soil samples through the season for texture, and various yield components. I actually did that, and a lot of the sample processing, I did that as well. And we did a lot of the soil stuff in our lab, and finally the data analysis. Now ADAS, they have the model, and they're a private consulting company, so we like to think of them as, you know, when there's a beauty contest and there's an independent KPMG kind of thing, and they're the unbiased people who are looking at who wins the competition. So this is what the map looks like. Actually, our student goes to school at the College of Geographical Sciences, so he was able to pull together this pretty cool map. And overall, we had 15 farmers growing spring wheat in 24 fields, and 6 farmers with 10 fields of winter wheat. So ideally what we'd like to see, so this year was very much about benchmarking and seeing what we could do, and like I said, working the bugs out of it. Ideally what we'd like to see is more farmers, like 40 to 50 is kind of the magic number. More farmers with essentially 1 field each. That's kind of what we're hoping for. The farmer effect, like what we're talking to, when we were talking to the farmers early on, we were like, okay, give us a good field and then one that's not so good, and then we could kind of figure out what was going on there. So Harvey summed it up. 2019, we had a relatively cool and wet spring, followed by a hot and dry summer, and then hurricane season wasn't the best. This is the winter wheat. It was a terrible year for winter wheat last winter. I think everybody remembers the ice rinks, and you know, as much as I like, I'll talk about it in a little bit. The winter wheat, it didn't look the best initially, but eventually some of it did catch up, and we did get some pretty good yields. The spring wheat definitely did a lot better this past year. So that's not something that we'd normally see. You would expect the winter wheat to do a little bit better than the spring wheat on a year-over-year basis, but the spring wheat was better this year. Okay, so here are the growth stages. Like I said, our student, whose name was also Aaron, was in the truck every week looking at the growth stages for all of these fields. And this is when he went on vacation. Students need vacation nowadays. And when we break it out by variety, you can see the difference between the winter wheat and the spring wheat. And I thought that it was kind of interesting here that you know, this 25R40 was quite a bit ahead of the other winter wheat, but really the 25R40 would be people who are planting winter wheat to take a harvest off the winter wheat, right? Probably not following potatoes, which is largely what this Enhancement would be. And this is a breakdown. These are the 6 varieties that were used right across the island. So, and this is the yield that we got on average. If there's no error bars, that means there was only one person that did it. And Dan McEachern and I actually entered a field into it. We're solid middle of the pack. Okay, we weren't last. And so, you know, if you get this with no error bars, then chances are there's only one or a couple people that grew it. Okay, so when we feed everything into the model based on the radiation interception and the rainfall, the highest yield potential, and I see a Wilkie fella here who's going to argue with this, but this was the very first year that we did this, right? So one of the big differences we all know between Western PEI and Eastern PEI is the planting date, right? So this is something that we have to build into our model that, you know, the soil temperature is probably significantly different from Eastern PEI versus Western PEI. So that's a whole aspect of the model that isn't taken into account in the UK that's fairly important here. And here's the Hall of Fame for 2019, and this was basically early January. Leonard McIsaac, so this is the calculated or percentage of your calculated potential. So this is making the best with what you had. Leonard came in at 66%. Anthony was second with 62%, and Ryan Hamill was third with 55%. And basically, what these are, this is a calculated yield based on, you know, essentially perfect conditions. Okay. Anthony and Leonard, these guys are neighbors. They talk all the time. And look how close those numbers are. So, I mean, those are respectable yields for the year that we just had. And Troy's coming in. Troy and Ryan are actually neighbors too. So we're expecting to see some folks up west place there next year, right? All right, so the overall, when we just kind of throw everything into a matrix and look at these correlations, I just wanted to talk about these organic matter, active carbon, and total carbon. These are actually the soil health measurements. And it was interesting to see that these were positively correlated with yield out of all the fields. I haven't talked to the soil health people yet, but we're going to do a deeper analysis on this and see, you know, what's the point of getting your soils tested for soil health if there really isn't any implication on yield? So we want to find out what's going on there. Stem length, positively correlated with yield, so that actually means the taller plants tended to have a higher yield last year. Seeding rate, higher yield. We did see a bump with sulfur, with applied sulfur. Basically, we have all of the like this wouldn't work unless farmers were as cooperative as they were. Like, they opened up their books, they showed us everything that they were spraying, all their fertility, and that's kind of the whole point of this is, you know, if you get a winning recipe, you want everybody to take something from that recipe and make it work for themselves, right? You know, we can stand up here and talk about what we do in the small plots, but it probably doesn't mean as much as, you know, Anthony neighbors down the road getting 2.5 tons per acre. Test weight was actually positive correlated with yield. Soil respiration, that was negatively correlated. So that's essentially when the microorganisms are chewing up the organic matter, it tends to increase the soil respiration. But that response is something you'd see in a drier year, and that's probably why. And you'll also see that in higher fertility regimes, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. Okay, so some of the analysis from the data, like, so I have everybody's data, and we haven't even begun to scratch the surface yet. And this was one of the stark things that just kind of popped out at me. So when we put yield on the y-axis and total nitrogen, there was absolutely zero relationship. So initially when you think about that, you're like, oh my God, that really doesn't make any sense at all. Like, how can, why is there no relationship with the total amount of nitrogen? And it was all about timing. So if I pull it out with the pre-plant as our blue, yellow is with the seed, and then top dress 1, top dress 2, if you did it, you can see there's really only a positive relationship with yield on the pre-plant and at the nitrogen that went down with the seed. We found, we've all been taught that we top dress to increase the protein. And when I plug that in with the protein for everybody's grain samples, again, we only really saw a response with the pre-plant nitrogen. And we saw a neutral and almost negative response for the top dressing. So based on the weather last year, anything applied after plant probably didn't get taken up into the plant at all. So, and this is one of Ruth's slides, and essentially this is kind of what we have to live with in PEI is, it's all about sending the roots down, building the factory, and then going for yield at the end. And I think this is, let me go back. How do I go back? Red? There we go. Okay, so this is the light interception, and this is the winner's field, and this was actually the lowest yield, and these were taken at exactly the same time, right? So at 50% light interception, and this is just basically a formula for the amount of light that's being captured and turned into photosynthate for the plant. This is a massive difference. And there's a movement in the UK now, they're calling it crop momentum, and it's the ability to keep your crop alive longer, to use more nutrients, to get more yield in the end. And again, that probably doesn't apply here. A later maturing variety is probably not going to get harvested in time, right? This was a big one. This was probably the biggest thing that we found from this past year. And when I say we, I mean my summer student dug holes in every single field. This was, we're going to have a meeting with the scientists about this. We tend to talk about things in terms of, we never dig holes. We never go into the fields and actually physically dig holes. And this was the first time since I started that we actually dug holes in every single field. And 43 centimeters is about 16 inches. And I thought, okay, well, maybe the summer students being lazy or something like that. And I dug into it a little bit more, and I talked to some of the guys who used to dig holes before I started. And you look at the old reports from the 80s, and basically, we should be at 60 centimeters, which is about 24 inches. And when we had the grower over here from the UK, he talked about deep ripping and, lifting up the soil. But in talking with Delmar Holmstrom, who was a scientist before I started, he said that that's it. Like, basically, there's no deep ripping, there's no pulling anything up. What we have is what we have. And so if we were at 60 centimeters and we're down to 43 centimeters, there's no new soil coming up. That's not something that's going to happen. I'm going to dig into it a little bit more, and like I said, we're meeting with the scientists, but what we have to think about is if we have that 43 centimeters and essentially the nutrients are going to travel with the moisture, And then we have that ledge where things are going to park until essentially November when they start moving again. Then initially, like we have to think about, our whole field as being 16 inches deep. And if we're putting in too much fertility, then it's either not going to get taken up or it's going to go away in November. So we're going to dig into this a little bit more. I know that when the UK farmer was here, there was a few people in the audience who had talked about doing deep ripping before, and they basically ended up with large rocks in the field. I think this is probably one of our biggest limiting factors for growing cereals in PEI. You don't notice it so much with the potatoes because, we're bringing the soil to the potato essentially, right? And so this is definitely on our radar. So I guess we have a bit of time. Shall I go into this? Okay. All right. So again, this is 1 year of data, and I just kind of wanted to hit home some of the things that we saw in our plots in 2019 and see how that compared to the data that we collected from the farmers' fields. And this is an experiment. Again, this is 1 year data, but it's basically the same year that we're collecting data from fields. We're looking at barley as a previous crop, soybean, faba bean, and pea. And then we're measuring nothing, 45-45 split of urea, and 30-30-30 split of urea, and agrotane 30-60 and 90. Now that was all top dressed. So that would have been after we counted the tillers and we just spread it on the plots. Obviously you're not going to incorporate it if it's a winter wheat field. So Misty's numbers for barley. Barley's not winter wheat, it's a totally different situation. This is May 2nd, and I'm just going to go back. When we talk about planting and when we were able to get in to plant this, the barley and the pea were essentially planted at the same time. Those crops are off early, and then we were able to go in with the winter wheat. The soybean and the faba bean, they were planted at the same time and they were later. So it was probably a little bit on the early side for the soybean and a little bit on the late side for the faba bean. This is the way things looked on May 2nd. And this is your late planting date. That's not really much of a cover crop, and it's probably not much of a yield either. This is July 2nd, and these are the barley and the pea, and this is the faba bean and soybean. And when we just look at timing, the pea and the barley, there was quite a bit more yield on them just based on the timing alone. When we look at just fertility, you can see that we got a pretty good response from the agrotane applied at 90 kgs per hectare. And, we're kind of wondering what, like if we went to 120, like would we still see that? But that'll be, that's an experiment for another day. And then when we pull it apart and look at both things, you can see that blue is barley and gray is pea. In every single case, the winter wheat was able to take advantage of that nitrogen that was left in the soil, send some roots down, and basically become established. With the faba bean and the soybean, it didn't happen. And the thing is with the faba bean is that is the highest nitrogen fixer of all the legumes that you can grow, right? So there should be tons of nitrogen, like literally tons of nitrogen in the soil. And the winter wheat, it's just way too late. It can't do anything with it. It can't turn that into yield the next year. And so we did see significant effects of the previous crop the nitrogen source, and we saw an interaction between the two. And the timing of planting, like honestly, I think if you're going for yield, that past the middle of September is probably too late, and you're seeing diminishing returns after that. So why do we do the N? As I mentioned before, we run our plots and we talk about it, but we probably don't have as much weight as, you know, talking to your neighbor and your neighbor's getting 2.5 ton. And that's the biggest thing for us is, you know, getting everybody involved. I mean, chances are, if you enter a field in the yen and you basically throw the groceries at it, it's not going to be economical. It's probably not going to be economical. It's going to cost you a lot of money, but it's for bragging rights, and you do learn from the whole experience, and then other people can learn from that experience too. And I think for the grain symposium, Steve's going to have the winners as a panel. Where's Steve? Yeah. So that's why I didn't go into the recipes that everybody had from last year, but I think that's going to be part of the grain symposium there next month. And as I mentioned, it's probably not going to be economical, and Roger and I argue about whether it's sustainable or not. Like, his idea is that, you know, you're using more of the fertility and it's a bigger yield, and therefore it is sustainable. You know, that's debatable. And I mean, what we're finding is we need more crops in our rotation. The balance between diversity and production, you know, in the UK, they're on a minimum 5-year rotation, right? So that probably says a lot. We know with a lot of the on-farm data that we've jumped into for the Grains Council, there's a very strong rotation effect that's masking some of our results. So rotation is probably one of the most important management tools that we have. Okay, and that's it. And I can answer any questions about any of that.
I've got a question for you, Aaron, on the yen for wheat. You mentioned we're using the UK model where they're calculating the 2 meters of rooting depth. So if we change that and start using something less, how will that impact our soil available water, and what does it do for our potential yield calculation?
Okay, so yeah, we knew 2 meters was not realistic, so we ended up with we went with the literature values, which told us that based on the soil map of PEI, we could expect a rooting depth between 60 and 80 centimeters. And so we just used 70 centimeters. And every time we dialed that down, so we tried using 70, 60, 50, 40, and every time we ran those numbers, it changed the response and who the winners were. We didn't manipulate it for that. We thought that 70 was achievable, and so we went with that. We went with that number. But just to hit it home, like that was a major. I mean, going from 70 to 40 significantly affected the results that we saw.
Any other questions or comments? Anyone? David?
Out of respect for Peter, I waited until he got here with the microphone. He's been working pretty hard trying to keep it in front of him. I have 3 of my yen reports in front of me, and every one of them surprised the dickens out of me with my pH analysis that came forward. And I was just talking to Leonard, and he was a little bit surprised at his too. Have you looked at that? I mean, you know, 7.1. I mean, that's great. I don't think I have 7.1 in that field. What are we doing different, or is there a different standard? Are we probing less deep? Where I'm assuming that the pH of the top 6 inches of soil would be much higher than if you probe down 18 inches and you mix 18 inches of soil together versus 6 inches.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so your soil definitely gets full. Yeah, the pH definitely goes down as you get deeper in the soil. I mean, those numbers are from the provincial lab. They just went directly into your report. And Harvey and Brian did the sampling, so you can talk to them. But yeah, no, that's absolutely, like, it's the I mean, it's not like you can, you know, fill up the profile with nutrients and get the same uptake at the same depth. I mean, it's definitely going to be lower as you hit that pan, essentially. But yeah, those numbers are from the province.
So are Harvey and Brian using the same protocol that we've all sort of been taught to, you know, when you sample your fields?
Yeah.
I guess I'm questioning the pHs on other tests I've done in my field now, so I'm kind of wondering, these 3 fields, are they right, or are the other fields I tested, are they wrong? It's raised some question in my mind about pH testing, and I guess I'd like to hear more, not necessarily today, but I'd like to hear more on how we can accurately sample our fields, just because this just raises a question in my mind.
Yeah. We've got a long term. I saw Ryan Barrett in here. So where's Ryan? Oh, there he is. Okay. We've got a long term experiment going on now, where we basically it's a 3-year. I think we're in our 15th year. Where we've tried managing for the 2 middle crops between the potato crop. And so we've done everything pH-wise to manage for those other crops. And we haven't seen a negative effect on the potato yield. So we're shooting for those 2. I haven't shown Ryan the data yet, but pH and organic matter are 2 biggest drivers here. And you know, that's all I can say on it. I don't know about 7.1 seems high to me too.
Aaron, what time of the year were the soil samples taken for pH?
Yeah, I think they were taken in the fall. I think they were. Where's Harvey? Yeah. When did you guys take those? Yeah, it was October or something, wasn't it? Yeah.
Aaron, is it doing leaf area index in the end project, or is it just plant height and seeding rate and population, that sort of thing?
Yeah, so leaf area index, we're trying to figure out how to measure that properly in the field.
Because your 2 pictures showed that. I mean, when you look at that, that's essentially what your visual is trying to create there, right? Leaf area index?
Yeah, so we measured the harvest index, which is, you know, the seed yield over the total plant biomass. In terms of, so normally they have a satellite system that they use to look at leaf area index, like in the field, and row closure and everything like that. The problem using that this year was that we had too many cloudy days, and everybody thinks back that, oh, it seemed like a really sunny summer, but you'd be surprised, like when the satellite goes by every 3 days, and that's your only window, you'd be surprised at how many cloudy days we have in the summer. So it's a really important piece of information, but we got to figure out how to get it. I think we might have to take pictures early on to look at, you know, green versus red, essentially.
Okay, thank you.
If there are no other